Hi there. So in this video, we have a little tour of Ajax logic, and I've got a prepared job here, and I'm going to show you how this works, what it does, and then we're going to rebuild it. So the basic conceit here is whenever we have two form elements that want to talk to each other, and specifically they're drawing data that may change or a lot of data, it's almost always a good idea to use Ajax queries. So here we have a prime example that I have two form fields, two select items to be specific. This first one here is called username, and the second one is called job names. And the conceit here is that we're using this Ajax module to tie these two fields together. For every username that we provide, when I change this item, when I select one, I'm going to search for all of the related job names. The tables that we're talking to are actually RackForms tables. So here I have FB admin, and FB admin has two rows right now, as we can see, and it has username Matt and Kathy. And you'll notice here that we have this user ID column 1 and 2. This 1 right here is my unique user ID, and it ties to the FB jobs table, specifically in this column. So user ID equals 1. That means if we read these two tables here, I, that is my user right here in RackForms, owns all of these jobs where user ID equals 1. And indeed, in this case, I actually own all the jobs. If there was a 2 sprinkled throughout here, then Kathy would own that particular job. So this is a relation between two pieces of data. And this relation is really important because this is how we should always be building things in a database. Is very rarely do we have a database table that sits on an island by itself. It's almost always related to something else. And the relationships are nothing special. They are just a name or a number or something that's unique that's in a different table than where it's originating from. So FB admin, this user ID originates right here. For every user that we add, we get another unique number to it. So if I added a third user here, they would simply get a new user ID, and it'd be automatically generated. So let's say we have Frank here. You'll notice here that the database automatically adds this user ID equals 3. So knowing that I have a unique number right here, any job, again, that has this 1 right here is the relation to that user. And so we exploit this essentially in the Ajax module. We exploit the idea that we have related pieces of information. So it looks a little something like this when we run it. So I'm going to select my username here. Here's my 3 users. You notice that this guy is just empty. When I select a user, though, you can see here are all the jobs that I own. And because these 2 users don't own any jobs, it is blank when we select them. So how do we actually build it? Let's actually just let's just delete this page and start over. So I'm going to add a sortable page, and just as we saw, I had those 2 select items. And let's first name these guys. So I'm going to say usernames, and I'll call it usernames. It's very important that we fill out a name/value here. And then this one we have job names. So this one will be called job names. You're going to see why this is important to name our fields in just a second here. Before we do that, though, one of the things that we should always be doing with Ajax calls is populating our first select item, that is the one that's going to kick off the process, with some kind of data from somewhere. Now we could, if we wanted to, scroll down here and add elements statically. Generally speaking, though, if we're doing that, it means that we've done something wrong with the Ajax logic. Because the Ajax logic should be derived from a database table, right? Like a data set of some sort. So for hard coding values, that means that it's probably not the right thing that we've done. However, because we know that we have this FB admin table right here with these 3 users, let's just call this with a dynamic query. So let's scoot this down here so you can see this. And so let's just do that. So we have this FB admin table. Let's scroll down to the select items data source properties right here. Let's just turn on dynamic query, and let's just say grab me, that is select the user ID, comma, username from FB admin, right? So it's SQL right here. Select the user ID, this column, the username, this column, from FB admin, this table. And now if we run the form, you'll notice now that when I select usernames here, we're going to have dynamic data populating in, but notice what we have here. We'd have these 3 numbers. So if I look at Firebug here, just activate it by hitting F12. If we actually look at our source of the select item, you can see here is where the issue is. The option value is Matt, Kathy, and Frank. The display value that we're showing to the users is 1, 2, and 3 right here, right? We actually want this to be the opposite way. It's a little bit tricky at first, but the idea is that when it comes to relating database tables to one another, the important thing is this unique value right here. We could have multiple users with the name Matt, so we would never use this as an identifying characteristic. However, as we saw here, again, when I add a new user to this database, the database automatically generates a unique ID for it. So when I put in John right here, notice that when I scoot over, without doing anything, it's just automatically created this new user ID. And so this is absolutely key. It is key that we respect that it's giving us unique ID and use that as the value that we pass to Ajax. So in other words, the value of the form field is Matt. We don't want that. We actually want this reversed. So the first thing I'm going to do then is I'm going to go back up to my source SQL right here. And there's a little note here that says all items are displayed as label : value. So that means that the first item that we have in our select statement is going to be the label, which it was. The user ID was in fact the label that we saw. And the value of the form field was the second item, username. So we just want to switch that. So I'm going to say grab the user ID and actually have it username, comma, user ID. Now when I do this, the username is what's showing as the label, and the value, that is that 1, 2, 3, 4, those all important unique identifying numbers, those guys are now our values. Now this is really important, these values right here, this 1, 2, 3, 4, when it comes to actually writing the Ajax. So let's actually start doing that. So I'm going to add the Ajax module in here. And the first thing that we do is scroll to the top and we write our SQL code to drive the Ajax module. So in this case, we want to display job names. So if we go back up to our table here, we go to FB jobs, what we're after is this column right here, job name. So our SQL statement is going to be select job name from FB jobs. Right? So we can just write that right now. Select job underscore name from FB jobs. Let's actually leave that where alone just for a second here. So select job name from FB jobs. Now here's the important bit. Remember, the table has this linkage in the form of user ID right here. So because we want to grab only those jobs which I own, that is, that have the user ID 1, we have to say where user underscore ID equals question mark. Now here's where a bit of the magic comes in. If I hard-coded this to say where user ID equals 1, it's not hard to see how a database query would in fact return all of those rows. So matter of fact, I can pop open query right here, I can paste this in, and when I run this, you can see here that we return job name and all those jobs that we have. Of course, the key here is that this value is dynamic, right? So when a user selects from the username list right here, they could be passing in any value. And so that's where the question mark comes in. The question mark simply says, when I select a value right here, it's going to take the value column, that is the value of the form field. Remember, if I select the item right here, it's going to take the value, 1, 2, 3, or 4. It's going to exchange that with the question mark when the form is run. So it's going to say select job name from FB jobs where user ID equals that value that we pass in. The last two things that we have to do then is we have to tell RackForms which form field we're watching right here, and then which form field gets updated. Now the form field that we're watching is usernames. So under Ajax update binding options, I'm going to say watch the usernames field. Then we have to say which event we want to look for. Now in RackForms and in indeed HTML, different types of events are caused by different types of form fields. Now when it comes to select items, that event that we're looking for is on change. And some of these, of course, don't really make sense. On key up, we're not really typing in a select field, so that one should be pretty easy. On click, that could potentially be something, but usually when it comes to select items, it should always be on change. Finally, as I mentioned before, the last thing that we want to do now is we said, all right, well, we're watching this guy for on change events. what actually gets changed when something happens to this guy? Well, that's where the item options / Ajax bindings comes in. So we're going to say bind this field as job names, right? So this guy right here is going to get bound whenever something changes with usernames. And then we actually have the ability to say which field we want to affect this as. Now, SQL query can return multiple fields, but in this case, we're only returning one, so we're just going to say return the job name. So the label element is going to set as job name. So when I run this form, I select Matt. We pass in that one value. The SQL statement gets run. Select job name from FB jobs where user ID equals that dynamic value. In this case, it was 1. And then because we said populate the job names field right here, the label element as job name, that's exactly what we're getting. So that is a quick overview of how RackForms works with Ajax support. Of course, this is a slightly more advanced technique to use Ajax, but if you practice like this, especially because we have these two tables in every RackForms installation, that is FB jobs and FB admin here, it should start making a little bit more sense. Of course, we also have the sample jobs, and these are all under Ajax. So we have lots of things that we could do with the Ajax logic. So we can have additional arguments. We have one for just doing the basic request, which is essentially what we looked at right here. And so hopefully this makes sense. So anyway, if you have any questions, of course, info@rackforms.com. Always happy to help.